Bobby Fischer played a lot of brilliant games in his career, but this 21-move Brilliancy against Robert Byrne in round 3 of the 1963-64 US Championships has to be one of the best. This game ends on one of the most famous positions in chess, and Fischer was awarded the Brilliancy Prize at the US Championships that year, a tournament that he won with an incredible perfect score of 11-0. Fischer was 20 years old when he played this game. He had the black pieces, and Robert Byrne, an international master, soon-to-be grandmaster at the time this game was played, had the white pieces. Byrne started us off with d4, and after knight of 6, we get c4 and g6. So basically kind of your Grunfeld King's Indian defense. After g3 from white, Fischer played c6 here. You may be wondering why black didn't simply play bishop g7. The problem is after bishop g7, bishop g2 from white and castles, now white gets to establish this really nice center with a move like e4. And so even in games that are played today, sometimes the move order, even though the pawn is pushed for black opts to play the move c6, because now this pawn can come up and it has a pawn defending. So Fischer basically saying early on that he wants to get a pawn in the center of the board. After bishop g2, we get d5 from Fischer, and we get pawn exchanges here. And after c takes d5, just normal development, bishop g7 from black. And here, a move that Robert Byrne made that maybe you wouldn't make today is he played the move e3. And the problem with e3, it looks like a kind of a normal developmental move, but it blocks in this dark square bishop, and it really weakens the light squares for white. And we'll see that the light squares are a weakness that kind of show up later in this game. So e3 from Robert Byrne. After castles from Fischer, knight e2, knight c6, and castles and b6 from Fischer here. We're kind of getting towards the middle game, and you can see the position is pretty much even. Here in this position, Robert Byrne played b3, and you may be wondering kind of why is he doing the same thing that black is doing? It looks very symmetrical. This position had actually been reached before in a game from 1937, and white played knight f4, and there were kind of a series of moves, e6, b3, bishop a6, but after kind of centralizing the rooks, neither side really had any advantage, and this game ended up in a draw. So I think both players are probably aware of this game. This was a Stahlberg versus Floor in 1937. Both players probably not wanting to play that. So white, instead of playing this knight out to f4, simply opted to play b3 right away. Fischer putting his bishop on a nice diagonal. I think as black here, right, you can move the bishop out to this square and this square, but the bishop's really just going to get attacked or traded. Moving it to a diagonal on this a6 to f1 diagonal is a really nice diagonal because it pins this knight, puts some pressure on the rook, and it's a lot more active diagonal for black. After bishop a3 from white, this is move 11, and if we just look at the position here, this is a perfectly symmetrical position for the most part. The only pieces that are on different squares between the two sides are the kingside knight and then these e-pawns. It's really interesting to see how Fischer takes a small imbalance of the position and really turns it into a huge advantage. And Fischer played the move rook e8. The idea being going to get this pawn unpinned by the bishop, and we're going to push e5. After queen d2 from white, we get e5 here from Fischer. And this is just a really interesting move from Fischer. The idea here is after e takes d5, knight takes d5, black has created an isolated d-pawn, which is a weakness in a position. But Fischer decides that having this weakness is worth the increased activity that his pieces get. And already we can see these light squares, which white weakened earlier by playing their pawn up to e3. Black's really able to key on these light squares. So the compensation for having this isolated d-pawn is that black has really active pieces. And what do you do here as white? You might be tempted to take the pawn, but the problem is after takes, black has a really nice tactic, knight check, right? And so this loses for white. After the bishop captures, you lose the queen. So the pawn looks like it's hanging, but it's actually not hanging. And in this position, Byrne played probably just the one bad move of the game, and that was rook fd1. And this is a classic case of the wrong rook move to the center. And if you've ever been in a position like this as white, you're always wondering, okay, which rook do I bring to the center? Robert Byrne played the wrong rook. He was probably thinking, oh, it's really nice to get this rook here on f1, kind of out from under this pin for the black bishop. But the problem with moving the f rook to d1 is now that this f2 square, the whole king side really is gotten a lot weaker. And so Fischer plays the move knight d3. A really nice move from Fischer, and already we can see this knight kind of octopusing here into the white position. Here Robert Byrne played queen c2, and I think Byrne didn't really realize what was going on in this position. He was kind of thinking, man, well, I'll just gladly give up my rook for this knight. You capture back with the bishop, and I'll win your bishop. So the only thing you can do really is retreat your knight back to the square it came from. The problem, though, is that Fischer had the fantastic knight takes f2. And after king takes f2, from white, we get knight g4. And just really great moves from Fischer here. What do you do as white in this position? Obviously, the king cannot come back to f1 because you get a really nice family fork right here. So the knight kind of forking all these pieces. And so the king comes back to g1. And both players saw all of this. Robert Byrne saw all of this. He knew that Fischer, when he moved that original knight to d3, probably wasn't going to retreat. It was probably going to go for f2. He knew that he'd take back with the king. He knew that the knight would come to g4. And so what gives here? Why is this such a brilliant game for Fischer if all of this was kind of played out? Well, what was really brilliant is that after Fischer took on this pawn, which everyone expected, and Robert Byrne plays queen d2, the thought that everyone had, including the grandmasters that were commenting on the game at the time, was that after knight takes d1, rook takes d1, and what's effectively happened is white has picked up two pieces, two of black's minor pieces, and they've given up a rook and two pawns, but they're going to get this d pawn back eventually, right? There's so many pieces keying in on this weak d pawn, and so even though white has lost the rook, they're still going to win this game. And this position is indeed a little bit better for white. But in this position, Fischer did not take the rook on d1. Instead, he played the fantastic knight takes g2. And so why is knight takes g2 such a good move? The reason is because now that the white's light square bishop is off the board, black's light square bishop is just becoming extremely powerful. It's completely unopposed on the board. And whenever you have a position like this after white takes here, where you have the bishop pair and your opponent only has one bishop, the most powerful bishop is this light square bishop, and that's because it's just totally unopposed on the board. And so Fischer really only had one move he could play in this position, and the move he played was d4. The idea being that with a tempo on this knight, this bishop now comes alive, and just look at this these fantastic diagonals for this dark square bishop, completely no response for white. So Fischer giving up the material, but realizing that it's really nice to have this light square bishop. After knight takes d4, we get bishop b7 check. What do you do here as white? Where does the king go? If the king goes back to g1, the problem with this is after bishop takes g4, queen takes g4, you got this great overloading tactic with rook e1 check. And after rook takes, the queen falls, right? So that's no good for white, so you don't want to do that. So what white would probably do in this position is play something like king f2, but then after queen takes, rook takes, white loses the rook anyway. And if we look here, black's got two rooks, white only has one rook, so white's down the exchange, and they're also down the pawn. So white's losing that game. So if we go back, so the king can't go to g1. What if you played something like knight f3? The problem with knight f3 is after queen takes d2, rook takes d2, we get bishop takes c2, and now both rooks are under attack. This knight is pinned, and this is just an absolutely losing position for white. So really the only move for Robert Byrne in this position was king f1. And now Fischer played the really great queen d7. And this is really a famous position in the history of chess. This is the 21st move of the game, and at the time that this game was being played, they had live commentary, and there were grandmasters commenting on the game. And people were not really sure if black had a big advantage in this position right here. Obviously, this bishop is really nicely placed. It's a great bishop. This bishop is really nicely placed. White's king is very exposed, but it wasn't really clear at the time what black's compensation was for all of these sacrifices. And the reason why this is such a famous position is because it was in this position on move 21 that Robert Byrne resigned the game. Bobby Fischer, writing about the game later on, called Robert Byrne's resignation in this position really a huge disappointment for him. So how does this game play out? What black is threatening is queen h3 check, and after the king moves to a square like g1, you get bishop takes, and after the queen takes, you get checkmate here on the square with the bishop keying in. So a lot of arrows there, but let's just show the way Fischer kind of had hoped it would have played out, and he actually wrote about this in his book, My 60 Greatest Games. He was hoping for queen f2, and now what that does for white is it allows the rook to defend this knight. The problem, though, is after queen h3 check, the king can't come to the e file because the rook covers. The queen cannot block check because the bishop covers that g2 square. So the king would be forced to g1. And it really is an incredibly famous position, even though it was never played. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can spot the fantastic winning tactic for black. So if you spotted the tactic, congratulations. It is a double overload tactic. An overload tactic in chess is when defensive pieces are stretched too thin, and so what you do is you overload them. And so the move for black is rook e1, a really fantastic move. If the queen captures the rook, you get a checkmate here on g2. So the white queen is kind of pinned down to the defense of this g2 square. And so the only move for white here would be rook captures e1. The problem, though, is that after the rook captures e1, now there's no defender of this d4 square. And so the next move for black is bishop takes d4, and there's really nothing you can do here. You'd have to capture back and queen g2 checkmate. So that would have been a really fantastic way to end the game. Obviously, white could always just throw a bunch of pieces at you, but the result is going to be the same with queen g2 checkmate. So a really fantastic checkmate. Another way this could have ended is if white would have just played like a total throwaway move like this. You'd get check, and the problem is if the king comes up, right, the queen's just going to sneak in here, so that's no good for white. So what they'll do is the king will come over, but then you get check here, and really the only move for white is to capture the queen, and then it's checkmate anyway. So really, so many tactics. Amazing that the grandmasters kind of commentating on the game didn't even realize that this was a winning position for black. And really amazing that Fischer was able to turn in about 10 moves a basically completely symmetrical game into a brilliant victory. Fischer went on to win the U.S. Championships that year, 11-0, a feat that's never been done again. Actually, if you win the U.S. Open with a perfect score, you get a $64,000 prize called the Fischer Prize. No one's ever won it. But yeah, incredible game from Bobby Fischer, one of his greatest. Thanks for watching this video. This game is featured in Bobby Fischer's classic chess book, My 60 Greatest Games. If you want to check out Fischer's own commentary on all of his greatest games, I highly recommend that book. I have that book. I'll put a link for you in the description. Thanks so much for liking and subscribing. I'll see you guys next week.